They came in silk and silver, one after another, a procession of noble daughters ascending the steps of the Iron Throne like offerings laid before a god who had forgotten how to want. Lady Seraphina of the Eastern Vale presented a chest of raw sapphires, each stone the size of a wolf's eye. She curtsied low, her golden hair cascading like a curtain of spun gold, her smile practiced and precise. But Silas Thorn, the Alpha King of the Iron Sovereignty, did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the far wall of the great hall, where torchlight carved jagged shadows into the ancient stone. His expression held all the warmth of a winter grave. Lady Cordelia of the Northern Ridge brought a sword forged in dragonfire, its hilt wrapped in white wolf leather. She knelt, offering the blade with both hands. "For the king who has no equal in battle," she whispered, her voice steady and reverent. Silas lifted a single finger from the arm of his black stone throne. Gideon, his scarred beta, stepped forward to accept the gift. Silas never touched it. He never touched anything. They had been arriving for 3 days. 47 women from the strongest packs in the realm, each one handpicked by their alpha fathers to compete for the one title every she-wolf coveted: Luna to the Alpha King. Queen of the 5 territories. Mate to the most powerful creature walking the earth. But Silas Thorn, the wolf, who had not smiled in 300 years, felt nothing. Not boredom, not irritation, not even the dull ache of obligation. Just a vast frozen silence where a soul should have been. The curse had taken his world centuries ago. It started with warmth, the ability to feel the sun on his skin. Then it took taste, then color. The world had faded to shades of gray and iron. Finally, it consumed his emotions. Joy went first, then grief. Even anger, the last thing that kept him sharp, had flickered out long ago. His wolf was a ghost inside him. It still lived, but it was numb, silent, buried deep under layers of spiritual permafrost. The 48th woman was stepping forward now, her emerald velvet dress sweeping across the floor, and Silas's attention had already drifted to the high windows. Outside, a gray sky pressed against gray mountains. The world looked exactly as dead as he felt. Then a disturbance. A murmur rippled through the back of the great hall. It wasn't the reverent hush of the court. It was something uglier. A scuffle. The sharp crack of a hand hitting skin. The sound of someone being shoved. Silas's gray eyes moved to the entrance. He didn't care about the noise, but his predatory instinct still tracked movement. She was small. That was the first thing he registered. Small, thin, and wearing a dress so faded its original color was a mystery. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a braid that was coming undone, and there was a fresh bruise on her jaw. 2 guards had her by the arms, dragging her back. A thick-necked Lord Baron of the Ashwood pack followed her with a look of pure disgust. "She is no one." Baron spat, his voice echoing through the hall. "A kitchen rat. She followed the procession like a stray. She should be removed before she embarrasses the king further." The girl didn't struggle. She didn't cry. She didn't look at the guards or the angry lord. She looked directly at the throne, directly at Silas. And for the first time in 3 centuries, something inside Silas's chest moved. It was a microscopic shift, like a tectonic plate grinding deep underground. His wolf opened one eye. "Release her." The words left Silas's mouth before his mind could stop them. His voice was low, rough, and jagged, like a blade drawn across stone. He hadn't spoken unprompted in weeks. The hall went dead silent. The guards dropped the girl's arms as if they had been burned. Gideon leaned in, his face etched with concern. "My king." Silas ignored him. His gaze was locked on the girl. She stood alone in the center aisle, surrounded by women in silk and jewels who looked at her as if she were a plague. She was holding something in her hands, not a chest of gems, not a master-crafted weapon. A sprig of wildflowers. They were small, yellow and white, the kind that grew in the cracks of the castle walls where the sun rarely hit. They were dusty and slightly wilted, but in this room of gray stone and gray souls, they were the only things that held a hint of life. She walked forward. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold floor. She stopped at the base of the throne's steps. She did not curtsy. She did not kneel. She stood there battered and small and held out the flowers. "You look hungry," she said. The court gasped. Lady Seraphina let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Hungry, you insolent wretch! He is a king, he wants for nothing." But the girl ignored the noblewomen. She kept her eyes on Silas. "Not hungry for power," she continued softly, her voice carrying a strange melodic weight. "Not hungry for conquest. You look like you are starving for a single spark of heat. I thought these might help." Silas stared at her. He looked at the tiny, fragile stems in her calloused hand. He reached out. Gideon started to move, perhaps to stop him, but Silas's aura flared a sudden cold pressure that pinned everyone in the room to their seats. Silas leaned forward and took the flowers. His fingers brushed hers. The world exploded. It wasn't a spark, it was a wildfire. The moment their skin touched, a physical wave of heat slammed into Silas's chest. It raced up his arm, flooding his veins like molten gold. For the first time in 300 years, he felt the texture of her skin. He felt the rapid, frantic beat of her pulse. His wolf didn't just wake up. It roared. A deafening, desperate, joyous howl that reverberated through his bones, nearly driving him to his feet. "Mate, mate, mate." The gray in Silas's vision flickered. For a split second, he saw the deep, vibrant green of her dress. He saw the dark, rich brown of her hair. He saw the startling, deep violet of her eyes. He gripped the flowers so hard the stems nearly snapped. His irises, usually flat and colorless, began to swirl with a sudden, violent gold. "What is your name?" Silas's voice was barely human now. It was a growl, a plea, a command, all in one. "Elara," she whispered. She took a half step back, her eyes wide as she saw the gold flooding his gaze. She felt it too. The bond, the tether, the impossible heat that was currently melting the ice around his heart. Baron of Ashwood stepped forward, his face red with fury. "Your Majesty, this creature is a wolfless Omega. She was cast out for being defective. She is a slave, nothing more." Silas turned his head. The gold in his eyes didn't fade. It burned brighter. The air in the hall grew heavy, suffocating. "Gideon," Silas said, his voice dropping to a register that made the torches on the walls flicker and die. "If Lord Baron speaks again without my permission, remove his tongue." The silence that followed was absolute terror. Silas descended the steps. He had not risen from his throne for any of the 47 queens. He had not moved for 3 days. But now he walked down until he was standing directly in front of Elara. Up close, she smelled of wood smoke, wild thyme, and something deeper, something ancient and warm that made his wolf press against his ribs until they threatened to crack. He looked at the bruise on her jaw. He looked at her thin wrists. The rage that filled him wasn't the cold, mechanical anger of a king. It was the primal, obsessive fury of a mate. "You will stay," Silas said. It wasn't a request. But it wasn't a cold command either. There was a fracture in his voice, a raw, bleeding need that he couldn't hide. Elara looked up at him. The gold in his eyes was flicking, struggling against the gray ice that tried to reclaim him. She could feel the cold radiating from him, an abyss of frost that went down forever. "I have nowhere else to go," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "But I will not be a prisoner, Alpha King. I have had enough of cages." The corner of Silas's mouth moved. It wasn't a smile, he had forgotten how to do that. But it was the ghost of a memory. "Then stay," he whispered, leaning down until his forehead almost touched hers. "Because you choose to." They gave her a room in the East Tower. It was sparse but clean. A narrow bed, a stone hearth, and a tall arched window that overlooked the inner courtyard where the king's elite warriors trained at dawn. For Elara, it was a palace. It was the finest room she had ever stood inside. She stood in the center of the woven rug for a long time, listening to the bitter wind howling against the thick glass, trying to process the tectonic shift in her reality. She knew about mate bonds. Every wolf did. Even the cast-offs, the rejects, the ones raised in kitchen corners and forced to sleep on freezing dirt floors. The bond was sacred, it was involuntary. The inner wolf recognized its other half before the human mind could even comprehend it. But Elara had never shifted, not once. Lord Baron had used that as justification for everything. The beatings, the starvation, the years of backbreaking labor without status, without protection, without a name that anyone bothered to remember. She had been told all her life that she was defective, too weak, too small, too broken to carry the predator spirit that should have lived inside her. If she had no wolf, how could the bond have formed? Elara pressed her palm flat against her chest. Right there beneath her ribs something fluttered. It was the sensation of a heartbeat that wasn't entirely her own. It was quick, fierce, and achingly warm. The Alpha King's pulse echoing inside her own body. A soft knock at the heavy oak door broke her thoughts. She opened it, half expecting Lord Baron's guards coming to drag her to the dungeons. Instead, she found a small, round-faced woman with kind eyes and a dusting of flour on her heavy linen apron. "I am Marta," the woman said, simply stepping inside. "I run the fortress kitchens. I brought you something to eat." Marta set a heavy silver tray on the small table. Rich, hearty venison stew. Freshly baked bread that smelled of butter and yeast. A steaming cup of spiced cider. It was a feast fit for a lord handed to a kitchen rat. Elara stared at the food, her stomach twisting with a hunger she had forced herself to ignore for days. "Thank you," she whispered. Marta did not smile. Her kind eyes were lined with a deep, chronic worry. "Eat quickly, child, and listen to me. I wanted to tell you before the court gossips do." The last woman who held the king's attention was Lady Thessaly. She was beautiful, ambitious, and she told everyone in the kitchens she would be Luna within the month. Elara paused, the wooden spoon halfway to her mouth. "What happened to her?" Marta's voice dropped to a hushed, frightened whisper. "She vanished. 3 months ago. Morgana said she left of her own accord, but Lady Thessaly's winter cloaks were still in her wardrobe, and her prized mare was still in the stables." "Who is Morgana?" Elara asked, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "The king's royal advisor." Marta glanced nervously at the door, as if the shadows themselves were listening. "She has served the Iron Throne for 300 years, since before the curse. She is the one who assigned you this room. This specific room isolated in the East Tower, far away from the king's guard." Marta backed away toward the door. "Be careful who you trust in this fortress, Elara. Not everyone who smiles at you wants you to survive." The heavy door clicked shut. Elara sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The stew was warm, but the air in the room suddenly felt like ice. She looked down at her hands, remembering the searing, impossible heat when her fingers had brushed the king's. She was in a cage of stone, surrounded by predators, but for the first time in her life she had something worth fighting for. On the other side of the fortress, in the deepest chambers of the royal wing, Silas Thorn was losing his mind. He sat on the edge of his massive empty bed, staring at his own hands. In his left palm rested the sprig of wildflowers Elara had given him. They were fragile, insignificant. But to Silas, they were a lifeline pulled from the bottom of the ocean. The warmth from her touch had faded within hours. The curse was fighting back. The brutal, suffocating cold had rushed back into his veins with a vengeance deeper and more agonizing than before, as if punishing him for the momentary thaw. The gray was creeping back into the edges of his vision, but his wolf would not be quiet now. After centuries of dead silence, the beast inside him was pacing, snarling and clawing at his ribs. It pulled toward the East Tower with a single-minded, violent obsession that bordered on madness. Mate, protect, claim, mate. Silas squeezed his eyes shut, his breathing ragged. The phantom heat of her skin was branded into his memory. He could still smell her. Wild thyme and wood smoke. It overpowered the scent of the dying fire in his hearth. "My king." The voice was smooth, cold, and ancient. It slid through the shadows of his chamber like a serpent. Silas opened his eyes. Standing in the doorway was Morgana. She wore robes of deep violet. Her hair was silver, woven into intricate braids that spoke of the old world. Her face was unlined, frozen in time by dark magic she claimed to use only for the sovereignty's protection. She had been his mother's advisor, and his mother's mother's before that. "You should be resting," Silas, Morgana said, stepping into the room. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees with her presence. "The court is in an uproar. 47 high-born ladies are insulted. Lord Baron is demanding reparations for the theft of his property." Silas stood up. He dwarfed the witch in size, his massive frame casting a long, terrifying shadow across the stone floor. "She is not property," Silas growled. His voice vibrated with a dangerous, barely contained violence. "She is my mate." Morgana's eyes flashed a brief spark of something ugly and calculating. "She is a wolfless stray, a defect. She cannot bear you an heir, and she cannot command a pack. The bond you feel is a trick of the curse, Silas. A cruel illusion meant to distract you from your duties." Silas stepped closer. He looked down at the ancient advisor. For 300 years he had accepted her guidance. For 300 years he had believed her when she said the curse was incurable, a chronic rot that he simply had to endure. But as he looked at her now with his wolf awake and screaming in his blood, he smelled something he had never noticed before. Decay and ozone, the bitter metallic stench of dark magic. "Do not tell me what my wolf feels," Morgana Silas said softly. The threat in his tone was absolute. "If a single hair on Elara's head is harmed, if she trips on the stairs, if she chokes on her food, I will not ask questions. I will simply tear you apart." Morgana stiffened. It was a microscopic flinch, but to an alpha it was a confession screamed into the silence. "As you wish, my king." Morgana bowed her head, her voice dripping with false submission. "I only seek to protect the Iron Throne." She turned and glided out of the room, leaving a trail of freezing air in her wake. Silas looked back down at the yellow and white flowers in his hand. The ice was trying to freeze his heart again, but he clamped his hand around the fragile stems, letting the pain ground him. He had to see her. The logic of a king told him to wait, to be strategic, to let the court calm down. But the wolf inside him was drowning, and Elara was the only oxygen left in the world. He threw open his chamber doors and headed for the East Tower. He was a creature of the dark, navigating the winding ancient corridors with predatory silence. He did not know that Morgana was already watching from the shadows, her violet eyes burning with centuries of stolen power, plotting exactly how to bury the kitchen rat before the king could fully thaw. Elara could not sleep. The stone walls of the East Tower seemed to hum with a restless, freezing energy. Or perhaps it was her own blood vibrating with the echo of the Alpha King's pulse. When the midnight bell tolled, echoing across the snow-covered courtyard, she slipped out of her narrow bed. She wrapped a heavy woolen blanket around her shoulders and opened her door. The corridor was empty, lit only by the sputtering orange glow of dying torches. She did not know the layout of the Iron Sovereignty, but she did not need a map. Something ancient and instinctive was guiding her. She followed a faint metallic scent in the air, a mix of old parchment-bound leather and dried ink. It led her deep into the western wing, down a spiral staircase, and into the royal archives. The library was cavernous. Towering shelves of black iron reached up into the darkness, packed with centuries of werewolf history. It was a graveyard of forgotten knowledge. Elara lit a single tallow candle and moved through the aisles. She was looking for a name. Thessaly. She was looking for a word. Curse. She spent hours pulling dusty ledgers and brittle scrolls. She read through lineage records and territorial treaties. Lord Baron had whipped her once for caught reading a discarded piece of poetry, but an old blind Omega healer had taught her the letters in secret. Knowledge was the only thing no one could beat out of her. Deep in the restricted section, hidden behind a row of rotting military journals, she found it. A thick tome bound in cracked white leather. The title was faded, stamped in dull silver. The Bloodfrost Era. Elara sat cross-legged on the freezing stone floor, setting the candle beside her. She opened the heavy cover. The pages were brittle, the ink dark brown. She turned the pages carefully, her eyes scanning the ancient script. 300 years ago, the text read, "The Iron Throne executed a rogue witch for practicing blood magic." In her dying breath, her mother cast the blood frost curse upon the Alpha King's line. The curse will consume the victim slowly. First warmth, then sensation, then emotion, then the wolf, and finally the life. Elara traced the words with a trembling finger. "The curse is not self-sustaining," the text continued. "To hold an Alpha King in ice, the magic requires a tether. A living anchor residing within the fortress walls, feeding the spell with their own will and dark magic. As long as the anchor breathes near the king, the ice will never melt." Elara's breath hitched. Morgana, the ancient advisor who never aged. The woman who had served the throne for 3 centuries. She wasn't advising the kings. She was slowly murdering them. Elara turned the page, desperate for a cure. The blood frost cannot be broken by force. It can't be broken by ordinary fire. Only the light of a Solaris Wolf can shatter the ice. The Solaris line, born of the sun and the first moon, carry warmth in their veins instead of a beast. They do not shift into fur and claw, they shift into light. Because of this, they are often mistaken for wolfless omegas. Elara stopped breathing, mistaken for wolfless omegas. She stared at the words as the pieces of her life slammed into place. The beatings, the mockery, the absolute lack of a physical wolf inside her. She wasn't broken. She wasn't defective. Her power was just buried, waiting for the right spark to ignite it. "You can read." The voice came from the shadows, low, rough, and vibrating with an authority that made the candle flame flicker. Elara did not scream. She did not even jump. She knew that scent. Ozone pine and winter storms. She looked up. Silas Thorn stepped out of the darkness. He was not wearing his crown or his heavy royal furs. He wore a simple black tunic, his chest rising and falling heavily as if he had been running. His gray eyes were locked on her, but the edges of his irises were bleeding into that dangerous hypnotic gold. "An old healer taught me when I was 7, Elara said quietly, not closing the book. Lord Baron had her whipped for wasting time on an omega. She taught me in secret after that." Silas stepped closer. The shadows seemed to part for him, bending to his massive frame. He looked at the pale, bruised girl sitting on the floor of his library, bathed in the tiny halo of candlelight. She looked fragile enough to break, but her eyes held a fierce, unbreakable iron. "What are you reading?" Silas asked. "A history of the blood frost curse," Elara replied. Her voice was steady, holding his golden gaze. "Fascinating subject, particularly the section about how it is maintained." Silas went very still. The air around him dropped in temperature, frost creeping up the legs of the iron bookshelves. Elara did not look away. "Someone in this fortress is keeping you dying, Your Majesty," she said softly. "And they have been doing it for 3 centuries. A log collapsed in the massive fireplace at the end of the hall, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The sudden light caught the violent gold, flooding Silas's eyes. "You found this in 3 hours," Silas said, his voice laced with a raw, painful wonder. "I found it because I looked," Elara said. "Has no one else?" The question landed like a boulder dropped into a frozen lake. The answer was a truth Silas had never allowed himself to examine. No. No one had looked. Gideon was loyal, but he was a soldier, not a scholar. The council managed the curse like a chronic illness. Treatable, never curable. And Morgana. Elara watched the realization strike him. She did not speak. She let him connect the dots. Morgana. Silas whispered the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. "She has been at court for 300 years, since before the witch was executed. And when Lady Thessaly began to get too close to you," Elara said carefully, "she disappeared. The kitchen staff said Morgana assigned me to the East Tower. She isolated me, just like she isolates you." The cold inside Silas's chest clenched like a fist. But it was not the numbness of the curse. It was something entirely different. It was fear. A terrifying, desperate fear of losing the only light he had seen in 3 lifetimes. "Why are you telling me this?" Silas asked, stepping into the candlelight. Elara closed the heavy white book and stood up. She barely reached his chest, but there was nothing small about the way she looked at him. "Because you took my flowers," she said simply. "And because I think you have been starving for a very long time, and no one in this entire fortress cared enough to ask you why." Silas crossed the remaining distance between them in a single desperate stride. He stopped inches from her. He was close enough that she could feel the unnatural, magical cold radiating from his skin. Close enough that his breath should have been warm against her forehead, but it was freezing. His massive, scarred hand rose. It trembled. The Alpha King, a warrior who had slaughtered entire armies without a second thought, was shaking. His fingers hovered an inch from her bruised jaw. If I touch you, Silas whispered, his voice wrecked, broken. The warmth comes back, but it leaves again. And each time it leaves, the cold is worse. The curse fights it. It punishes me for feeling. Elara looked up at the broken king. She saw the absolute terror in his golden eyes. He was not afraid of pain. He was afraid of hope. She reached up. She took his trembling hand in her small, calloused fingers, and she pressed his palm flat against her cheek. The warmth exploded. It surged between them like a dam shattering. It was not just heat. It was sensation, texture, the impossible softness of her skin, the frantic flutter of her pulse beneath his fingers, the vivid, intoxicating scent of wild thyme. Silas gasped, a deep, ragged sound that tore from his throat. The gray washed completely out of his eyes, replaced by a blinding, brilliant gold. The color bled back into his vision. He saw the red of the book binding. He saw the yellow of the candle flame. He saw the purple of her bruise. Then we will just have to be faster than the curse, Elara whispered, holding his hand against her face. Silas pulled her to him. Not gently, desperately. His heavy arms wrapped around her small frame, burying his face in her dark hair. He held her as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling off the edge of the world. The ice in his chest cracked, melting under the sheer, undeniable force of the mate bond. Elara, he breathed. Her name in his mouth was not a command. It was a prayer. I cannot lose you. I will burn this fortress to the ground before I let her take you. Elara wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her ear to his chest. Beneath the layers of ice and dark magic, she heard it. A strong, steady heartbeat. You will not lose me, she promised the king. From the dark balcony overlooking the library, two violet eyes watched them embrace. Morgana stood in the shadows, her lips curled into a wicked sneer. The anchor of the blood-frost curse felt the ice cracking. So the kitchen rat wants to play with fire, Morgana whispered to the empty air. Let us see how she burns. The morning sun broke over the jagged peaks of the Iron Sovereignty, casting long, pale rays through the high windows of the great hall. Silas Thorn sat at the head of the massive obsidian council table. He was holding a silver goblet of dark wine. He brought it to his lips and took a slow drink. For the first time in 3 centuries, it did not taste like wet ash. It tasted of dark berries, oak, and sharp spice. He lowered the goblet, staring at the dark liquid. He looked up at the banners hanging from the vaulted ceiling. They were not just dark cloth anymore. They were a deep, violent crimson. He looked at Gideon standing by the doors and noticed the faint pale pink of the old battle scar running down the beta's cheek. The gray was breaking. The ice was fracturing. Silas closed his eyes and inhaled. He could smell the roasted meats from the kitchens, the sharp tang of pine needles from the courtyard, and the faint lingering scent of expensive perfumes from the noble daughters who were still stubbornly pacing the halls, waiting for an audience. He was alive. The realization was staggering, but beneath the overwhelming rush of sensory input, a dark, urgent drumbeat hammered in his chest. His wolf was awake, and it was violently protective. Gideon Silas commanded, his voice deeper and richer than it had been in ages. Gideon stepped forward, his eyes widening slightly. He could smell the shift in his alpha. The dead, frozen aura that usually choked the air around the king had been replaced by a heavy, crackling power. Yes, my king. Take 4 of my personal guard. Station them at the base of the East Tower. No one goes up those stairs. No noble daughters. No lords. Silas paused, his jaw tightening. And absolutely no advisors. Gideon bowed deeply. It will be done. But Silas was already too late. High above the bustling courtyard, in the isolated chill of the East Tower, Elara was making the bed when the fire in her hearth suddenly died. It did not burn out naturally. 1 second the logs were crackling with bright orange flames, and the next they were swallowed by a suffocating, unnatural darkness. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly, stealing the breath from Elara's lungs. Frost began to crawl up the stone walls, tracing jagged black patterns like the veins of a dying animal. Elara backed away from the hearth, her heart hammering against her ribs. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and lengthen, detaching themselves from the walls. They gathered in the center of the woven rug, twisting into a tall, imposing silhouette. Morgana stepped out of the darkness. The ancient witch did not look like an advisor today. Her violet robes seemed to absorb the little light left in the room. Her eyes glowed with a toxic, unnatural purple hue. "You are a very foolish girl," Morgana said smoothly. Her voice echoed in the small room, layered with the hiss of 100 whispering voices. Elara stood her ground. She did not cower, though her hands trembled from the biting cold. "I know what you are," Elara said, keeping her chin high. "I read the archives. I know you are the anchor for the blood frost." Morgana laughed. It was a terrible sound, like glass breaking over stone. "Reading a dusty book does not make you powerful, little rat. It only makes you dangerous. And I have spent 300 years removing dangerous things from this fortress." The witch took a step forward. The air grew so cold that Elara's breath plumed in thick white clouds. "Did Marta tell you about Lady Thessaly?" Morgana asked, her voice mocking and light. She was so sure of herself, so sure her beauty and her high-born blood could thaw the frozen king. She managed to make him smile once, just once. Morgana raised her hand. A ribbon of black mist slithered from her fingertips, circling Elara's ankles like a snake. "Do you know what happens to a wolf when their heart freezes completely?" Morgana whispered, stepping closer. "They do not die right away. They turn to living statues. Thessaly is still in the crypts beneath the castle. She can see, she can hear, but she will never move again. She is a monument to my patience." Elara gasped as the black mist crawled up her legs, bringing a numbing, paralyzing agony. It felt like needles of ice piercing her veins. "You cannot hold him forever." Elara forced the words out through chattering teeth. "He is waking up. His wolf knows." "His wolf is a chained beast," Morgana hissed, her face contorting with sudden rage. "I built this kingdom, I kept the iron sovereignty standing. While his weak, pathetic bloodline withered, I will not let a nameless, wolfless stray ruin my masterpiece." Morgana thrust her hand forward. The black mist surged, wrapping tightly around Elara's throat. Elara was lifted off her feet. She choked, her hands clawing desperately at the invisible, freezing grip on her neck. The room spun. The gray void was rushing in to claim her. Morgana was trying to freeze her from the inside out, pouring centuries of dark magic directly into Elara's lungs. "Die quietly, little rat," Morgana whispered, watching Elara struggle. "Be another mystery for the court to gossip about." Elara's vision began to dim. The cold was unbearable. It was reaching for her heart, trying to extinguish the only warmth she had ever known. Lord Baron had beaten her. He had starved her. But he had never touched her soul. In the darkness of her fading mind, Elara remembered the words from the white leather book. "They carry warmth in their veins instead of a beast. They shift into light." Elara stopped fighting the grip on her throat. She closed her eyes. She stopped looking at the terrifying witch and looked inward. Deep down, beneath the trauma, beneath the bruises, and the years of being told she was nothing, she searched for the spark. She remembered the feeling of Silas's hand against her cheek. She remembered the fierce, protective rhythm of his heart. "I will not die in the dark," Elara thought. "I refuse." A pulse of energy throbbed in her chest. It was small, microscopic, but it was not a wolf's growl. It was a note of pure, resonant heat. Suddenly, a faint golden glow emanated from Elara's chest, shining right through the fabric of her faded dress. Morgana gasped, taking a stumbling step back. The black mist around Elara's throat hissed violently, as if a drop of water had hit a scorching iron pan. The golden light flared just an inch, but it was enough. The icy grip shattered. Elara dropped to the floor, coughing violently, gasping for the freezing air. The frost on the walls nearest to her immediately melted, dripping down the stone in small rivulets. Morgana stared at the coughing girl, her violet eyes wide with a mixture of shock and absolute horror. You are not just a defect." Before the witch could raise her hands to strike again, a sound echoed through the east tower that made the very foundation of the fortress tremble. It was a roar, not human, a monstrous, apocalyptic roar that shattered the thick glass of the arched window in Elara's room. The heavy oak door was not pushed open. It was ripped off its iron hinges, flying across the room and smashing into the far wall into a shower of splinters. Silas Thorn stood in the doorway. He was fully shifted into his half-form. His body was massively expanded, corded with thick muscle and covered in patches of midnight black fur. His claws were extended, scoring deep gouges into the stone floor. But his eyes were what froze the blood in Morgana's veins. They were blinding, radiant, predatory gold. Morgana instantly dropped her hands. The black mist vanished. She arranged her face into a mask of terrified concern, rushing toward Elara. "My king," Morgana cried out, her voice trembling perfectly. "Thank the gods you are here. I came to check on the girl and found her collapsing. The cold in this tower must be too much for her frail constitution." Silas did not look at Morgana. He moved with terrifying speed, crossing the room and dropping to his knees beside Elara. He scooped her off the freezing floor, pulling her small body against his massive, burning chest. Elara buried her face in his neck, her hands gripping his tunic. She was shaking, but the moment his skin touched hers, the remaining frost in her veins melted away. Silas wrapped his arms around her tightly. He buried his nose in her hair, inhaling deeply, checking for blood, for injury. Underneath the scent of her wild thyme, he smelled it, the bitter, rotting stench of dark magic. Silas turned his head slowly, his golden eyes locked onto the ancient witch. He knew. Elara did not have to say a word. The mate bond screamed the truth of the attack into his mind. Morgana took a step back, hitting the stone wall. The Alpha King was not the numb, compliant puppet she had managed for 3 centuries. He was a beast off its chain. "Get out," Silas growled. The sound vibrated the stones under their feet. Morgana bowed her head, hiding her panicked eyes. "Of course, my king, I will send for the healer." "You will send for no one." Silas snarled, his fangs fully bared. "You will leave this tower, and if you ever come within 100 feet of my mate again, I will tear your head from your shoulders and mount it on the iron gates." Morgana fled, slipping out the broken doorway and disappearing into the corridors. Silas looked down at Elara. He gently brushed a strand of dark hair from her face. His massive hand was warm, so incredibly warm. "She knows," Elara whispered, her voice hoarse. "She knows what I am. She will not stop Silas. She will try to kill me in front of the entire court to prove I am weak." Silas's jaw clenched. "Let her try," he promised softly. "Let her step into the light. Because the era of the blood frost is over. We are going to war." The Great Hall was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The final feast of the procession had begun, marking the end of the 3-day trial. The 47 noble daughters sat at the long wooden tables, picking at their roasted pheasant and honeyed roots. The air was thick with tension and the suffocating perfume of desperate ambition. They all knew the king had not chosen a Luna from their ranks. They also knew a nameless girl from the kitchens had been moved into the East Tower. Silas Thorn sat at the head of the high table. He was not the frozen gray statue who had received them 3 days ago. The change in the Alpha King was undeniable. The pale, deathly pallor had left his skin. He sat straight, his massive shoulders relaxed but dangerously alert. He held a silver goblet, and when he looked around the room, his eyes caught the torchlight flashing with a brilliant, predatory gold. The lords and alphas of the 5 territories whispered behind their hands. Lord Baron of Ashwood drank heavily, his face flushed with angry humiliation. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. The whispers died instantly. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain stopped. Complete, breathless silence fell over the massive room. Elara walked in. Marta had found her a dress deep in the forgotten royal wardrobes. It was not spun from gold, and it held no jewels. It was a simple, elegant gown of deep crimson velvet, the exact shade of the Iron Sovereignty's war banners. Her dark hair was brushed and left to fall freely down her back. The bruise on her jaw had faded to a pale yellow, but she made no effort to cover it. She wore her survival like a badge of honor. She walked down the center aisle. She did not look at the glaring noblewomen. She did not look at the sneering Lord Baron. She looked only at Silas. Silas stood up. The sound of his heavy wooden chair scraping across the stone floor echoed like a gunshot. The Alpha King stood for her. He had not stood for a single royal daughter, but he rose to his full terrifying height for the kitchen rat of Ashwood. He extended his massive hand as she approached the high table. Elara placed her small fingers in his palm. The moment their skin connected, a visible wave of heat radiated from them, melting the remaining frost that clung to the edges of the high table. Silas pulled her gently to his side, seating her in the empty chair beside his throne. The Luna's chair. The court erupted. Voices shouted in protest. Lords slammed their fists on the tables. Lady Seraphina stood up, her face twisted in aristocratic outrage. Silence. Gideon roared, stepping forward and dropping his hand to the hilt of his sword. The beta's voice cracked like a whip, silencing the uproar. But from the shadows near the great hearth, Morgana stepped forward. The ancient advisor glided into the center of the hall. She wore her violet robes, her silver hair catching the firelight. She looked calm, too calm. She looked like a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "My king," Morgana said, her voice magically amplified to carry to every corner of the room. "You sit a nameless stray in the seat of the Luna. You insult the noble bloodlines of the 5 territories." "I do not care about your bloodlines." Silas rumbled, his voice dark and deadly. "I have found my mate. The matter is settled." "It is not settled," Morgana shot back, turning to face the crowd of angry lords. "The laws of the Iron Sovereignty are sacred. They were written to keep the pack strong. A Luna must be capable of leading. She must be capable of defending the pack. She must have a wolf." Morgana pointed a long bony finger directly at Elara. "This creature has no wolf. She is a defect. A genetic dead end cast out by her own alpha." "Lord Baron, is this not true?" Lord Baron stood up, puffing his chest out. "It is true. She is a wolfless omega. She could not shift if her life depended on it. She is nothing." Morgana turned back to the throne, her violet eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "The law states that if a proposed Luna is deemed unfit, any ranking member of the court may challenge her claim. For the protection of the pack? For the sanctity of the throne." Silas's lips pulled back over his fangs. A low, terrifying growl began to vibrate in his chest. "Morgana, step back into the shadows before I bury you in them." But Morgana did not step back. She raised her arms and her voice rang out like an iron bell. "I invoke the right of challenge. I, Morgana, High Advisor of the Iron Court, challenge this wolfless stray for her place. Tomorrow at dawn in the fighting circle. A duel of blood and magic." The great hall exploded into chaos. The right of challenge was ancient, it was brutal, and it was absolute. If a challenge was invoked, the king could not interfere. If he did, he broke the foundational law of the wolves, risking immediate rebellion from all 5 territories. Morgana had trapped him. "No!" Silas roared. His voice shattered 3 stained glass windows high above them. He vaulted over the high table, landing on the stone floor with an impact that cracked the tiles. He marched toward Morgana, his claws fully extended, his eyes burning with lethal intent. "I will tear you to pieces right here," Silas snarled, ignoring the panicked shouts of the lords. "If you kill me, you break the sacred law," Morgana said, not backing down, a wicked smile playing on her lips. "You prove you are a tyrant, corrupted by a stray. The territories will fracture. There will be civil war. Is that what you want for your kingdom, Silas?" Silas raised his hand to strike her down anyway. He did not care about the kingdom. He only cared about Elara. "Silas, wait." The voice was soft, but it stopped the Alpha King in his tracks. Elara walked around the high table. She stepped between Silas and the ancient witch. She looked up at the massive, furious king. She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his racing heart. The heat of her touch grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of a massacre. "Do not break your kingdom for me," she whispered to him. She turned to face Morgana. The witch was taller, older, and radiating dark, oppressive magic. But Elara stood tall in her crimson dress. She did not look like a stray. She looked like a queen who was finally ready to wear her crown. "You want to prove I am weak," Elara said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "You want to show the kingdom that I am broken." Morgana sneered. I want to clean the dirt from the Iron Throne. Elara nodded slowly. Then I accept your challenge. Silas grabbed her arm, spinning her to face him. His eyes were wide with panic. Elara, no, you do not know what she is. She will kill you. She is the anchor. Elara whispered fiercely, stepping closer so only he could hear. I read the book, Silas. The curse cannot be broken by force. It has to be broken by light. If you kill her here, the curse might stay in your blood forever. The pack has to see what she is. They have to see the dark magic she has been using to poison this court. I do not care about the curse, Silas pleaded, his voice breaking. I care about you. If I lose you, I will never survive the ice again. You will not lose me, Elara promised, reaching up to cup his face. Her thumbs brushed over his cheekbones. I have spent my entire life being beaten down in the dark. I am done hiding. Tomorrow at dawn, I am going to burn her shadows away. Silas looked into her deep violet eyes. He saw the iron resolve there. The absolute certainty of a woman who had survived hell and was not afraid of the devil. He pulled her into his chest, wrapping his arms around her as if his body alone could shield her from the coming dawn. The great hall watched in stunned silence as the terrifying Alpha King buried his face in the neck of a nameless Omega, trembling. Morgana turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, her violet robes sweeping the floor. At dawn, the witch called back over her shoulder, "Let us see if the little rat knows how to bleed." Dawn broke over the iron sovereignty, but the sky offered no warmth. A thick, freezing mist clung to the ground, swallowing the lower half of the ancient standing stones that formed the fighting circle. The entire pack had gathered. Warriors, lords, servants, and the remaining noble daughters formed a massive silent ring around the sacred arena. Their breath plumed in the freezing air. The tension was so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the courtyard. Silas stood at the edge of the boundary line. He was a statue of coiled, violent kinetic energy. His jaw was locked, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were bone white. Gideon stood a foot behind him, flanked by the royal guard. They were not there to protect the king. They were there to restrain him. If Silas stepped into the circle, the law was broken, and the kingdom would fall into civil war. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Morgana entered the ring. The ancient advisor did not walk in as an old woman. She entered in her shifted form. She was monstrous, an enormous, unnatural beast of pitch-black fur and twisted, jagged muscle. Her eyes burned with a toxic violet light, and thick tendrils of black mist leaked from her jaws with every exhale. She did not smell like a wolf. She smelled of graveyard dirt and centuries of stolen magic. Lord Baron of Ashwood smirked from the front row. "The Omega will not last 10 seconds," he muttered to the lord beside him. Then Elara stepped into the circle. She did not shift. She could not. She walked onto the frozen, blood-stained earth in her human form. She wore the deep crimson dress, her feet entirely bare against the jagged frost. She carried no weapon. She possessed no armor. She looked impossibly small, standing across from the towering nightmare of dark magic. Morgana released a deafening, demonic howl that shook the standing stones. She did not waste time posturing. She lunged. She moved with terrifying, unnatural speed, a blur of black fur and violet energy aiming straight for Elara's throat. "Elara!" Silas roared, his voice tearing from his chest. He lunged forward, but Gideon and 3 guards grabbed his arms, digging their heels into the dirt to hold the Alpha King back. Elara did not run. She did not cower. As the massive jaws snapped shut inches from her face, she dropped to her knees, sliding under the beast's sweeping claws. Morgana skidded across the frost, spinning around with shocking agility. The witch sneered, her violet eyes flashing. If she could not tear the girl apart with claws, she would freeze her soul into dust. Morgana slammed her massive front paws into the earth. A shockwave of pure black mist exploded from the ground. It surged across the circle like a tidal wave of liquid nitrogen. The temperature plummeted so fast that the grass beneath it instantly shattered into black ice. The mist slammed into Elara, engulfing her completely. The crowd fell dead silent. Lady Seraphina smiled coldly. Lord Baron let out a sharp bark of laughter. It was over. No human, no wolfless Omega could survive a direct hit of dark magic. Silas stopped fighting the guards. He went completely, terrifyingly still. The gold in his eyes began to flicker, threatening to die out. "No," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. The ice in his chest, the curse that had tortured him for 300 years, surged forward to reclaim his heart. Inside the cocoon of freezing black mist, Elara was dying. The cold was absolute. It was not just freezing her skin, it was freezing her memories, her thoughts, her very will to live. Morgana was pouring 3 centuries of malice directly into her veins, but as the darkness closed in, Elara felt it. A faint, frantic rhythm against her own chest. The echo of Silas's heartbeat. The memory of his warm, massive hand against her cheek. The way he had looked at her in the library, not as a kitchen rat, not as a defect, but as his equal. She was the Solaris Wolf. She was born of the sun, and she absolutely refused to die in the dark. Deep within her chest, a spark ignited. It was not a fire, it was a star. Outside the mist, Morgana let out a victorious growl, pacing around the black dome of magic. But suddenly, she stopped. Her violet eyes widened. A beam of blinding golden white light pierced through the black mist. Then another, and another. The crowd shielded their eyes as the dome of dark magic began to hiss and boil. The temperature in the courtyard spiked violently, the freezing mist evaporating into steam. The frost on the ancient standing stones began to melt, water streaming down the rocks like tears. With a sound like shattering glass, the black mist exploded outward, obliterated by a shockwave of pure, radiant heat. Elara stood in the center of the circle. She was hovering inches above the ground. Her crimson dress rippled in an invisible, scorching wind. Her dark hair floated wildly around her face, and her eyes, her deep violet eyes, were gone. They were replaced by twin pools of blinding celestial white light. Behind her, towering 20 feet into the air, a spectral projection manifested. It was a wolf made entirely of golden sunlight and white fire. It did not snarl, it did not roar. It simply radiated a majesty and a heat so intense that the front rows of the crowd had to take a step back. "Impossible!" Morgana hissed, her massive wolf form shrinking slightly under the oppressive, blinding light. "The Solaris line is extinct." "You missed one," Elara's voice echoed. But it was not just her voice. It was a chorus. The sound of 1,000 sunrises layered over a single spoken word. Elara raised her hands. The golden light flared, illuminating the entire courtyard. And in that pure, unforgiving light, the truth of the Iron Sovereignty was finally laid bare. The light hit Morgana, stripping away her illusions. For the first time, the entire pack could see it. Thick, pulsating chains of black energy connected the witch's chest directly to Silas, who stood at the edge of the circle. The tethers of the Bloodfrost curse. A horrified gasp rippled through the thousands of wolves watching. "She is the anchor," Gideon shouted, pointing his sword at Morgana. "The witch has been cursing the king." The lords who had supported Morgana, who had believed her lies about the weak royal bloodline, stared in absolute terror as the visual proof of her 300-year treason glowed in the light of the Solaris Wolf. Morgana panicked. She lunged forward, desperate to kill the source of the light, her jaws snapping wildly. Elara did not even flinch. She pushed both of her hands forward. A torrent of golden fire erupted from her palms. It did not burn flesh. It burned magic. The light slammed into the ancient witch, and Morgana screamed. A wretched, high-pitched shriek of a demon being exorcised. The light traveled up the black tethers of the curse, racing toward Silas. "Silas, look at me," Elara commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. Silas locked his golden eyes on hers. Elara clenched her hands into fists. The spectral Solaris wolf behind her threw its head back and released a silent, earth-shattering howl. The black chains of the curse snapped. The sound was deafening, like a glacier cracking in half. The shockwave knocked wolves off their feet. Silas collapsed to his knees, burying his hands in the dirt. He gasped, sucking in a massive, ragged breath. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had crushed his soul for 3 centuries vanished in a single, devastating instant. The world exploded into vivid, blinding color, the green of the pines, the blue of the morning sky, the crimson of Elara's dress. He felt the heat of the sun on his shoulders. He felt the damp earth beneath his fingers. He felt the furious, unbound, completely resurrected roar of his alpha wolf inside his chest. In the center of the ring, the golden light faded. Elara lowered gently to the ground, her feet touching the warm, thawed earth. She swayed slightly, the immense power draining her physical strength. A few feet away, Morgana lay in the dirt. The dark magic that had kept her young and powerful for 3 centuries was gone. She was not a massive wolf anymore. She was a shriveled ancient woman, her hair thin and white, her skin resembling cracked parchment. She wheezed, her violet eyes dull and terrified. The courtyard was dead silent. The curse was broken. The witch was exposed. And the nameless kitchen rat was standing in the center of the circle, bathed in the morning sun. Then the earth trembled as Silas Thorn stood up. The earth trembled as Silas Thorn stood up. He did not rise like a man waking from a long sleep. He rose like a god of war stepping out of a tomb. He inhaled deeply, his massive chest expanding as he took in the scents of the world. Pine needles, wet earth, sweat fear, and the overpowering, intoxicating scent of wild thyme. He looked at his hands. He could feel the cold morning air moving over his skin, raising goosebumps. He looked at the sky. It was not a flat dead gray, it was a piercing, brilliant blue. His wolf, silenced and buried in ice for centuries, let out a psychic roar that forced every lesser wolf in the courtyard to instantly drop their gaze and bare their necks. The alpha of alphas was back. Silas walked forward. His heavy boots crushed the thawed earth of the fighting circle. He did not look at the lords. He did not look at the trembling noble daughters. He walked straight to the withered, gasping form of Morgana. The ancient witch dragged herself backward, her bony fingers clawing desperately at the dirt. "Mercy," she rasped, her voice sounding like dry autumn leaves crushing together. "I serve the throne. I kept the bloodline pure. I kept you strong." Silas stopped. His shadow fell over her, cold and absolute. "You kept me in a cage," Silas said. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated in the teeth of everyone watching. "You stole my warmth. You stole my mother. You turned innocent women into monuments of ice." He did not strike her. She was already broken, stripped of the dark magic that had sustained her unnatural life. Death would be too quick a mercy. Gideon, Silas commanded without looking away from the witch. "My king." Gideon was there instantly, his sword drawn, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and furious loyalty. "Take her to the deep crypts," Silas ordered. "Chain her to the wall beside Lady Thessaly and the others." She froze. "She will not be executed. She will live the rest of her miserable mortal days in the dark, surrounded by the statues of her own cruelty. Let the cold she worshipped be her only company." Morgana screamed a pathetic, broken wail as 2 royal guards grabbed her arms and dragged her away from the circle. The architect of the blood frost curse was gone. Silas turned his attention to the crowd. His golden eyes swept over the thousands of wolves. He was searching. He found his target. Lord Baron of Ashwood was sweating profusely in the freezing air. His face, usually florid and arrogant, was chalk white. He tried to step back to hide behind a taller lord, but the crowd instinctively parted, leaving him completely exposed in the front row. "Lord Baron," Silas said. The name rang out like a death sentence. Baron fell to his knees, immediately pressing his forehead into the mud. "Your Majesty, I did not know, I swear on my ancestors, I did not know what she was. If I had known she carried the Solaris blood, I would have treated her as royalty." Silas closed the distance between them in 3 massive strides. The heat radiating from his body was palpable, a stark contrast to the magical cold that used to choke the air around him. "You would have treated her as royalty," Silas repeated softly. He crouched down, bringing his face level with the trembling lord. "You beat her because you thought she was weak. You starved her because she had no title. You judged the worth of a soul by the power it held, not by the kindness it offered." Baron was openly weeping now, his hands shaking. Mercy, Alpha. Please, I am a loyal servant of the Iron Sovereignty. You called her a kitchen rat. You offered her to my court as a joke, a stray to be thrown out in the snow. Silas stood up to his full terrifying height. His voice boomed across the silent courtyard meant for every lord, every warrior, every citizen of the pack. The Ashwood pack is hereby dissolved, Silas declared. Its lands belong to the crown. Its warriors are folded into the royal army. And you, Baron, you are stripped of your title, your wealth, and your rank. You will leave this fortress today with nothing but the clothes on your back. You will walk into the outer territories as a rogue, a nobody, a stray. Let us see how long you survive when the world treats you exactly the way you treated her. Baron collapsed, sobbing hysterically into the dirt, but no one moved to comfort him. 2 guards hauled the disgraced lord to his feet and dragged him toward the heavy iron gates. Justice had been served. The rot had been cut out of the kingdom. Silas turned around. Elara was still standing in the center of the fighting circle. The blinding golden light was gone, leaving her looking human again. She looked small, frail, and exhausted. Her crimson velvet dress was stained with dirt at the hem. She was breathing heavily, her bare feet planted on the damp earth. She looked like a girl who had just fought a war against the darkness and won. Silas walked toward her. His massive chest heaved with an emotion he had not felt in 300 years. Love. Overwhelming, consuming, terrifying love. He stopped an inch from her. He reached out with both hands, gently framing her face. Her skin was warm. His skin was warm. There was no magical barrier. No creeping frost, no agonizing withdrawal of sensation. It was just heat. Pure, human, undeniable heat. You broke the ice, Silas whispered, his voice cracking. A single tear cut a path through the dust on his cheek. You gave me back the world. Elara smiled, reaching up to cover his massive hands with her own. I told you I was not going to die in the dark. Silas looked at her. He looked at the woman who had walked into a court of vicious wolves with nothing but a sprig of wildflowers. The woman who had looked at a frozen monster and seen a starving man. He stepped back. He reached up and removed the heavy black iron crown from his head. The crown of the Thorn dynasty. The crown that had sat on a frozen brow for 3 centuries, ruling a kingdom of gray shadows. Then the Alpha King of the Iron Sovereignty, the High Lord of the 5 territories, dropped to one knee in the dirt. He bowed his head, exposing his neck to her. The ultimate sign of absolute submission from an alpha. A collective gasp echoed around the massive courtyard. Kings did not kneel. Alpha kings certainly never knelt. My life is yours. Silas swore, his voice carrying the heavy, unbreakable weight of eternity. My throne is yours. My pack is yours. Command me, Elara. Command the Iron Sovereignty. Elara looked down at the terrifying king kneeling at her bare feet. She did not look surprised. She looked at him with the same steady, unbroken gaze she had given him on the very first day they met. She stepped forward. She placed her hands on his broad shoulders. Stand up, Silas, she said softly. The thousands of wolves in the courtyard hung on her every word. I do not want a subject. I did not break the curse to own a king. Silas looked up, his golden eyes filled with absolute, burning devotion. Elara took the heavy iron crown from his hands. Stand up, she repeated, her voice, gaining strength, echoing off the ancient standing stones. I want a partner. We rule together. Silas rose to his feet. He took her small hand in his massive one, intertwining their fingers securely. He turned to face the thousands of wolves watching them. Gideon was the first. The scarred beta drew his sword, held the flat of the blade against his chest, and dropped to one knee. The royal guard followed. Then the lords who had doubted her. Then the warriors. Finally, even Lady Seraphina and the remaining noble daughters sank to their knees in the thawed earth, bowing their heads in complete reverence. The entire kingdom knelt, not in fear of a frozen tyrant, but in absolute awe of the queen who had brought the sun back to the Iron Sovereignty. 3 months later, the gardens of the Iron Fortress bloomed for the first time in recorded memory. It was not just a slow, reluctant thaw. It was a violent, vibrant explosion of life. Wild climbing roses, a deep and velvety red, scaled the ancient black stone walls of the east tower. Thick vines of green ivy threaded through the heavy iron battlements, and the sweet, heavy scent of blooming jasmine spilled from window boxes that had stood empty and frozen for over 3 centuries. The fortress itself seemed to breathe differently now, as though the very foundation had thawed right alongside its alpha king. Silas Thorn stood on the wide stone balcony of the royal chambers, their chambers. He rested his massive hands on the stone railing, watching the sun begin its descent over the western mountains. He was still wearing his dark battle leathers, having just returned from a patrol of the outer borders, but the oppressive, terrifying aura of the frozen king was gone entirely. He looked at the sky. He did not just see light and shadow anymore. He saw a canvas of impossible, breathtaking colors. Fiery crimson, burnt orange, and deep, bruised violet stretching across the horizon. After 300 years of living in a world of flat, dead gray, Silas still sometimes stopped in the middle of a crowded corridor just to stare at the vibrant color of a tapestry or the bright blue of a morning sky. It was a miracle he swore he would never take for granted. A soft footfall behind him made his wolf stir. Not with the old frantic frenzy of a caged beast, but with a steady, deep, protective rumble that had become as constant as his own heartbeat. Elara stepped onto the balcony. She moved with a quiet, undeniable grace. She wore a simple, elegant gown of forest green, her dark hair pinned back to reveal the delicate curve of her neck. The bruise on her jaw was a distant memory. The hollow, haunted look of the abused kitchen rat had vanished completely, replaced by the serene, absolute confidence of a Luna who knew exactly what she was worth. She walked up beside him and leaned into his side. Silas's arm came around her waist instantly, pulling her flush against his solid frame with the ease of a man who had learned slowly and with profound wonder that the warmth he felt would never be taken from him again. A messenger arrived from the outer territories, Elara said softly, resting her head against his chest. A letter from the new leadership of the Ashwood Pack. Silas's arm tightened slightly around her. The mere mention of the place that had caused her so much pain still made his fangs ache to lengthen. And what does the new leadership want? They are asking for a formal trade alliance, Elara replied, looking out over the blooming gardens. Lord Baron's brother has taken over. He enclosed a personal letter to me. He formally apologizes on behalf of his entire bloodline for the treatment of an honored wolf who should have been recognized and protected. He is begging for the crown's forgiveness. Silas let out a low, rumbling scoff. It seems ruling through cruelty becomes much less popular when the kingdom next door proves there is another way. He looked down at her, his golden eyes entirely soft. Do you want me to burn the letter? Or do you want me to send the army to burn what is left of their manor? Elara smiled. It was a radiant, beautiful expression that still made Silas's chest fill with something so vast he could hardly name it. Not after 3 centuries without words for warmth, for joy, for the specific ache of loving someone so completely that the entire universe reorganized itself around her. No, Elara said, her voice filled with quiet strength. I want to frame it. I want to hang it in the great hall right next to the display case on the high table. Silas smiled then, a real genuine smile that reached his eyes. You kept them. Of course I kept them. Elara turned to fully face him, sliding her arms around his waist. Inside the great hall, resting on a pedestal of black velvet, was a sealed glass box. Inside the box was not a sword forged in dragonfire. It was not a chest of raw, uncut sapphires. It was a small, dried sprig of yellow and white wildflowers. The petals were brittle. The stems faded, but they were guarded by the royal knights with the same ferocity as the Iron Crown itself. It was the only gift out of 47 that you touched with your own hands, Elara whispered, looking up into his golden eyes. Silas raised his hand, his large calloused fingers gently tracing the line of her cheek. The sunset painted them both in warm golden light. Below them the gardens bloomed, and in the distance a wolf howled. It was not a howl of grief. It was not a warning of war. It was the simple, uncomplicated joy of being alive in a world that had finally, after 300 years of winter, remembered what spring felt like. It was the only gift worth keeping, Silas said, his voice a deep, resonant vow. They brought me empires, Elara. They brought me gold and weapons and power. But you brought me back to life. And the Luna of the Iron Sovereignty. The woman who had once been no one's daughter, who had walked into a frozen king's fortress with empty hands and a full heart, pressed her face against his chest. She closed her eyes and listened to the strong, steady heartbeat that she had restarted with a fragile flower, and the stubborn, luminous refusal to ever let the darkness win. And that is the epic conclusion to the story of the Frozen King and his Solaris Luna. What a journey! From a battered Omega offering a simple wildflower to the Queen of the Iron Sovereignty melting a 300-year curse. If this story moved you, if you loved seeing Silas drop to his knees for Elara after destroying her enemies, please take a second to hit that like button. It tells YouTube to share this romance with other listeners who love a good fated mate story. I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Do you think Silas gave Lord Baron the right punishment by stripping him of his title and making him a rogue? Or should the king have ended him right there in the fighting circle? Let me know what you would have done. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another long-form werewolf romance. Thank you so much for listening to the end, and I will see you in the next tale.